Another thing that I really like about Panel is that it's built on top of Bokeh, and because of that, it gives you a good number of escape hatches. Bokeh has, I appreciate the design philosophy behind Bokeh. Bokeh effectively has, right, a Python side and a JavaScript side, and they both have the same objects. They both have the same models. And so whenever you're writing the Python code, right, it feels like you're writing actual Python. You're not just passing in dictionaries or JSON objects, that get passed back and forth between the front and back end. You're actually using Python objects that are then serialized behind the scenes and then executed on the front end. Because of this, we can actually construct, right, this would internally be represented as a JSON object that has some executable code in it that's being sent to by the back end. But I can actually have my front end execute code as well. And so instead of just using onClick, I'll use the JS for JavaScript onClick. And you can see that when I click this button, I get a hello, and a nice alert window, but it says hello from JavaScript. And so by using Panel, right, we have a very high level interface that can run either arbitrary Python code or arbitrary JavaScript code. And it's linked from my front end to my back end, and I don't have to really worry too much about the details in between. And so for my full-time job as not a web developer, this is very handy because I can create database dashboards to share very quickly and very easily. So let's talk a little bit about design here. How are we going to approach this bot? Well, we can, of course, have kind of a monolithic approach here, and that the bot and the dashboard will be running in the same process. And for the most part, that's the example I'll be sharing with you. I'll share with you also how you can divide these two things up. But that simplifies a lot of the communication between the bot and the dashboard because they both share the same shared memory if they're running right on the same process, just in different threads. But even at a finer level of detail, how do we want the bot to interact with the dashboard? Does the bot even need to send anything to our dashboard? Well, for our link reviewing, well, we can think that if somebody posts a review, maybe that should pop up, right, as a notification on my dashboard, or maybe some type of news feed like system. And so that might be one of the things that my bot would want to communicate to a dashboard. On the other hand, what would my dashboard need to communicate to my bot? Well, my dashboard might need to inform my bot of updates, right? We were talking about, well, some URLs might need to be blocked. Well, my dashboard might need to notify my bot that. But that gets us into kind of a tricky space. And that tricky space is that, does my dashboard, is that what should be holding on to my data, persisting all of my data just in in-memory, in-process memory? I don't like that idea because, and you'll see while I prototype this dashboard for you, a lot of things are a little finicky. A lot of things need to be stopped and restarted and stopped and restarted and stopped and restarted until you get, to a level of stability that you're happy with. And if I'm going through and losing all of the commands, all of the past history, every time I stop and start my dashboard, well, I don't know how useful that is, because if it gets to the point where my dashboard is even stable or my bot's even stable and one of them fails, then I reboot my bot, I reboot my dashboard, and all of a sudden my bot has no knowledge of all the URLs that have already been blocked, and I have to restart from scratch. I'd have to open up my dashboard to enter, okay, block this URL, block that URL, block that URL. And that's not really a good, it's not a good feeling if that were to happen to you. And so what we typically would do is we would have some intermediary and some level of data persistence. And so in this case, we'll discuss using a database as an intermediary here, and the bot will effectively pull the database for some information, and typically it'll be acting on the latest information, so we'll want to make sure that this is an ahistorical database so we don't accidentally change some settings. And then our dashboard will also be pulling from that same database, except the dashboard will care about the history. And so that's why we're taking this approach of having a database of effectively events. And that way we don't lose any history by doing updates. And so we'll effectively just be using inserts here. But let's skip the database just for now, and let's see how simply we can get something working with a direct interface. And so I have all the code for my bot right here, and none of that has changed. And then what I've also created for you is a quick dashboard. And in this dashboard, what we'll be doing is we'll effectively be creating some widgets where you can perform inputs, perform actions that eventually control the bot. And so there's a few different ways we can approach creating this dashboard in Panel. As I mentioned before, Panel has this notion of widgets, this notion of panes, and it's built on top of a library called Param, which is what they use for the bidirectional interface. But how you can think of Panel is that widgets are things that take front-end input and can do things on the back end. They don't always have to do things on the back end, they can also do things on the front end, but widgets are your modality for interaction. Panes in Panel, panes are for rendering output. And so you'll see I have things like Markdown, you can have an HTML pane, you can have Matplotlib pane. And so these are very handy for rendering output. And what we want to do is we want to connect a widget to a pane so that we can dynamically update our output based on widget input. And then we also want that widget, whatever callback the widget is performing, we also want it to trigger something with our bot or maintain some state for the bot to access. So if I create a quick dashboard class here, I'll be using the param interface. And so this is essentially, you can think of this almost as a data class, and Panel can use this internally to perform some quick actions for us. And this will be my URL. And then we'll have a button, and the button's an action, and this action will be triggering an event that I define here on this class. Let's go ahead and create my panes. So these parameters will boil into our widgets, into the things that we can control, the statefulness, and then we'll want to create what contains the output here. And I typically do this, we'll do this within the init block of my parameterized class, pass those params down, and then I'll say something like self.blockPane. Right. And so I have two panes here. One is my block pane, and this will be, what are my currently blocked URLs? And then one is my link pane, and this will be based on data from the bot saying what link has been shared. Update your state. And we'll need to define a couple callbacks here, or a couple methods, to interact easily. And so in order to add a blocked URL, we're going to need to update this block list, and we're going to need to update the state of this block pane. And so the first thing that we'll do is do an append on my block list, just like that. And then I'll create, this is going to kind of pseudo create a markdown string, or just some bullet points, based on a list of inputs here, or a list of strings. And then we'll give that, that's our bullet point. It's going to be for you in, okay. And before we go ahead and get too deep into these callbacks here, the last thing I need to do is actually replace Now, with those two pieces added, I'll quickly add on right there, or I'll compose the layout. And you don't have to, this isn't a special, none of these are special class methods by any means. You'll see me using all of these individually. But I like to just attach the layout because my class here is my dashboard itself. So we'll create my layout here, and you've seen me do this before. call this dashboard link shares, give that a title there. And create blocked URLs there. And this will take the URL parameter. And remember, this is a string. When panel encounters, right, a parameter, specifically a string parameter, it assumes that this should be transformed into a text entry widget, which is in this case exactly what we want. And we called this one button, and so we'll pass that button in. And let's go ahead and create this instance. The nice thing, since this is very similar to a data class, I can pass in arguments here. Unlike data classes, param will actually perform type checking and other types of checks if I want to specify. For example, right, I can have an integer parameter, and I can provide that with a bounds, some bounds. So if I were to provide this here, right, I could say, give me a default of 0, and then, right, my bounds would be maybe no left bound, but don't input anything higher than 10, not allowed. And the nice thing is that whenever you're updating this, even within your stateful application, this bound will always be checked. And so it adds a layer on the back end, actually providing some input validation for you, which is fairly convenient. Okay, the next thing that we'll want to do, we'll actually just want to serve this dashboard. And remember, we have our layout here tucked away in the panel method. All right, let's see what we're working with here. We need that, params there. And I don't want to start my bot yet. I just want to take a peek at the dashboard, and we'll need panel serve right there. Okay. All right, and you can see this is pretty well mirroring, right, the layout that I have on the right hand side of my screen. I have my title, I have a subtitle, or H2 in this case. I have my URL, this is my text entry, and then I have a button that does something. And so let's go ahead and click that button, and you can see, ooh, a type error, none is not callable. And all this is saying is that, hey, you gave me an action, but you didn't say what to do with the action. And so the quick thing that we can do for this action is actually just give it a lambda. This lambda will have access to the current instance of this class. And so we'll just call the add blocked URL method. And since it has access to the current state of the class, we'll pass in, right, the URL. So let's go ahead. I do want to add one thing, right? If url.strip, if there's nothing in the URL, just don't do anything. Pretty safe, no nonsense default there. Do want to change this to show equals false so I don't open up a million tabs, right? Let's go ahead. Okay, I click it, nothing happens. I don't get an error this time. I see. And so we have made a typo in our list comprehension here. This should be for you. And let's give that a refresh. Test. All right, so it looks like we are executing our code here. Let's take a look at what's being passed inside block string here. And you see that we have our test. And the last thing that we need to do, we have our URL, we have our button that does something, and the last thing we need to do is actually include the output markdown here. And so this will just be adding our block pane. Give this one more go here. And you can see I've added my test URL. And so, right, I could add actual URLs, or I can add, just numbers here. But the whole point is we actually have a reactive dashboard up and running. It's actually passing information from the backend. The backend's processing that information, creating some new output, and then updating the front end from that output.